All right. Is that working for everybody?
Yes, thanks.
Yeah, okay, great. So hello, my name is Rowan Red Sky, and thank you for the wonderful introduction and for including me in this event and this amazing panel. It's been awesome so far, so thank you. Today I'll be discussing a particular set of stories that feature serpents, which are found in the oral tradition of the Haudenosaunee. So because we're all tuning in from different places, I'd like to just take a moment to situate the Haudenosaunee. The Haudenosaunee are a political confederacy made up of 6 nations originally located south of Lake Ontario in what is now upstate New York. The word Haudenosaunee means people of the Longhouse, which describes the geopolitical shape of the territory and the people's framework for community relations. Today, I'll mainly discuss the Seneca Nation and specifically the Tonawanda Seneca located near Niagara Falls. In my research on Haudenosaunee history, I've become deeply interested in stories about serpents, especially a particular version that is printed in the footnotes of Lewis Henry Morgan's 1851 publication, League of the Iroquois. The story is unattributed, leaving us to guess who the informant might be. And to summarize the story, an Indigenous maiden is promised to marry a man she despises. Taking fate to her own hands, she launches a canoe and goes over the Niagara Falls. However, she's rescued by the Thunderers. The Thunderers inform her of a serpent that has been poisoning the water and devouring the people. She returns to her people from the Thunderers' domain, and the people move away from the serpent. It pursues them, and the god Hino defeats it with a thunderbolt. The serpent's enormous body floats down the river and becomes stuck in the Niagara Falls. The falls collapse and form the distinctive horseshoe shape of the eastern side of the falls. This story occurs early in the archive of salvage ethnography, so it's hard to say if one like it was popular in oral tradition before this publication, just going off of the archive alone. However, it appears to be a unique construction that combines 4 different story types from both Euro-American and Haudenosaunee traditions. The earliest of the Euro-American Niagara myths about Indians, canoes, and animals going over the Niagara Falls was written by the French explorer Louis Hennepin in 1678. And by 1842, the story was a staple in English tourists' guidebooks. Another type of Euro-American fiction is the deathly maiden, who is entangled in an ill-fated romance and inevitably commits suicide. The earliest prototype for these stories that I've found in the archive is a play from 1690, and the theme repeats throughout the 19th century in stage dramas, poetry, and fiction. In a type of Indigenous story I call afterlife vessels, a protagonist pursues a deceased loved one into the afterlife, using a canoe or some other vessel to navigate the waters on a journey between life and death. The earliest of these stories is in the Jesuit Relations from 1636, and it remained popular throughout the late 19th century, and eventually was appropriated into Euro-American poetry and fiction. Finally, the 4th type of story is the Otgon serpent. Otgon refers to the serpent's corrupted nature and potent power to cause disease and death, and was first described by the Huron-Wendat to the Jesuits in 1648. Stories of these serpents were popular throughout the 19th century, exploded in popularity in the early 20th century, and remain popular today. Before Morgan's text was published, the most prominent collection of serpent stories was found in Tuscarora native David Cusick's self-published book, Sketches of the Ancient History of the Six Nations. In respect to this publication, I want to touch on two ideas. First, the many different stories of serpents in Cusick's book seem to express a common theme of territorial concern. There's warring with foreign nations, there are interrupted relationships with allies, and the serpents define the kind of land that Haudenosaunee people occupy and natural borders like lakes. Second, the issue of authorship and attribution comes into play alongside territorial concerns when Cusick's work is traced through the archive. For example, Henry R. Schoolcraft's 1846 book, Notes on the Iroquois, was the result of taking a census of the Iroquois of New York State. In this book, Schoolcraft republishes significant portions of Cusick's story and his print, Arodaho, without attribution. He also copied all four of David Cusick's woodcuts in the 1851 book, Historical and Statistical Information, respecting the history, condition, and prospects of the Indian tribes of the United States. But who is Morgan's informant for the snake story of 1851? The footnote in Morgan's book is unattributed, but Tonawanda Seneca Eli S. Parker is acknowledged as a substantial contributor in Morgan's opening dedication to the book, calling the book the fruit of our joint researches. Where Parker's authorship is specifically attributed, credit is given for a very particular kind of written narrative, the authentically eyewitnessed event that evidences what Ganawagi Mohawk and political anthropologist Audrey Simpson calls a narrow and procedural approach to literature on the Haudenosaunee. But in regards to Eli Parker's contributions to Morgan's book, Simpson calls Parker a designer and author of culture. An attributing note would have been important to Morgan for impressing the authenticity of an observed event on the reader, and to borrow Parker's authority to witness and translate it. But this kind of attribution was probably not thought necessary for a paraphrased legend that was seen as part of the distant past. I interpret the Snake Maiden story as a Seneca tradition that incorporates elements of the Euro-American popular culture of the time, and that this was done specifically for the purpose of digressing about socio-political tensions that were important to the Haudenosaunee, and more specifically, the Tonawanda Seneca. To devise this story, the author would require skills in English and Iroquoian languages and culture, which Eli Parker demonstrates. At the time that Parker met Morgan in 1844, Parker was accompanying a delegation of Tonawanda Seneca, acting as an interpreter. The group was petitioning to abrogate the Buffalo Creek Treaties, which essentially sold their land out from under their feet and left them vulnerable to forced removal and relocation. I believe the specific territorial concerns of the Tonawanda Seneca, who were located near Niagara Falls, affected the development of a new internarrative context for the Otgon serpent traditions, and one that specifically references Europeans. And there's a little bit of evidence to back this theory. Harriet Maxwell Converse explains in her collection of Iroquois myths and legends that the snake Ojibwe had come to be regarded as a prophecy of the white man's greed for land and their desire to dispossess the Indigenous people to get it. It's important to note here that Eli Parker's grandnephew, Arthur Parker, took an extensive role in editing and arranging the text after Converse's death. And so this interpretation of the narrative not only has a Haudenosaunee editor, that editor is a family member of Eli Parker and has ties to the Tonawanda Seneca. David Cusick's text also tells the story of Ojibwe, couching the narrative in three different timelines. There's a timeline legible to Europeans describing European occupation of the land. There is a differently conceptualized legendary timeline of Haudenosaunee sovereign leadership. And there is an event that involved land cessations by a contemporaneous group of Indigenous people. Eli Parker's Snake Maiden story had a profound influence on ethnographic style Indigenous stories that were published in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Iterations of the Snake Maiden story containing the four elements of Niagara myths, deathly maidens, afterlife vessels, and Otgon serpents were repeated throughout the latter half of the 19th century and are represented in travel guides, books, paintings, prints, and even musical compositions. These publications all have in common that the Haudenosaunee people and culture is othered and viewed through the lens of legend as something of the past. In Indigenous communities, ancestral narratives are recontextualized to address contemporary issues that will impact people and their future generations. And I wanted to finish this presentation with a small example of how stories can be carried forward in contexts that can be considered a kind of orality or an evidence of a living oral tradition. So in the example on the left is a picture of a multidisciplinary art exhibit that I designed around the serpent narratives based on my experience of hearing these stories before I had ever encountered them in the archive. And on the right is an image that Haudenosaunee storyteller Perry Ground posted to his Facebook community to illustrate his contemporary version of the Snake Maiden story. These material, textual, and digital retellings are evidence of living oral traditions that engage communal gatherings and contemplations of the future through a recitation of tradition. And for me, it calls into question the authorship of such stories and how we decide to attribute that authorship. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Rowan. That was terrific. We'll turn it over now to our last presentation for this panel, Brandon Castle and Rebecca Henning.
Hi, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen here. All right. Okay. Can everybody see that okay?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Awesome. Yeah, so hello everyone, and thank you for joining us this morning for our presentation, Doing Indigenous Book History at Amherst College. To start, my name is Brandon Castle. I'm the project coordinator for the Mapping Native Intellectual Networks of the Northeast project, which is aimed at increasing scholarly and community access to the collection of Native American literature at Amherst College. And I'm also pursuing an MLIS degree at San Jose State University through the Bridging Knowledge Scholarship Program, which aims to support Indigenous scholars into the field of librarianship. And I'll hand it over to Rebecca to introduce herself.
And I'm Rebecca. I've been a cataloging librarian here at Amherst College since 2001, and I started working with special collections materials in 2009.
So today, Rebecca and I will be sharing with you all information about the collection, so the history and scope and the process of how it came to the college. We'll also be sharing more about our grant project involving outreach to Indigenous communities in the Northeast, as well as the development of a digital interface which displays Native literary traditions and our experiences of building regional partnerships with libraries and archives in the Northeast as well. So to provide an overview, the initial collection arrived in 2013 when a local rare bookseller, Ken Lopez, was selling a collection of Native American authored literature collected by the philanthropist Pablo Eisenberg, which comprised of writings from the 1700s to the 21st century, many of which are rare editions, including numerous inscribed copies, association copies, and copies that belong to notable authors and scholars with their notes. The collection represents some of the earliest published writing by Native American authors, including Samson Occam, who was a Mohegan minister whose writing dates back to the 18th century, as well as William Apez, and Elias Boudinot, all the way up to authors and literary works published today. There is a wide variety of genres, such as fiction, poetry, cookbooks, activist manifestos, children's books, and most recently, comics and zines. Indigenous communities across the continent are well represented in the collection, including many nations from the Northeast and New England region. One of the goals in further developing the collection is to document as comprehensively as possible the printing of Indigenous authored texts. So just to continue here, here's a image of the collection on the Ken Lopez Bookseller website. So yeah, since the acquisition of the Eisenberg collection in 2013, the Archives and Special Collections has received numerous gifts and has made numerous purchases of individual books and small groups of books. Today, the collection comprises of multiple discrete collections, as you can see here. Since the collection arrived, it has been an instrumental component in the development of Native American and Indigenous Studies curriculum at Amherst, and has been taught in numerous classes in American Studies and English. The collection is one of the most heavily used special collections in the library, with use from students, scholars, authors, and community knowledge keepers, all of which who have expressed surprise and delight with findings in the collection. We also maintain relationships with several members of the Antiquarian Booksellers Association of America, who are on the lookout for additional Native authored materials. And here's just a photo of some recent classes that have used the collection for their course. And in June 2018, and as well as May 2021, a Rare Book School course was hosted at Amherst College and was taught by Mike Kelly, who's the head of the Archives and Special Collections, and Kiara Vigil, who's a professor of American Studies. The course was titled History of Native American Books and Indigenous Sovereignty, which the collection provided a comprehensive history of Native American engagement with books and a wide range of approaches Indigenous people have taken to the colonial technology of printing and publishing. And more information can be found on that course on the Rare Book School website, History 150. So to summarize the history and scope, information about all donors is included in catalog notes to make the provenance of our materials absolutely clear. One way this has occurred is that relationships with donors and authors, if they sign the copies or where the books were purchased, that is noted in the library catalog. And cataloging librarians like Rebecca have meticulously cataloged the collection since it came to the college in 2013. So with that, I will hand it over to Rebecca to share a bit more about this process and the catalog.
Thank you, Brandon. I want to talk about how library catalogs don't occur in a vacuum. There is a huge network of resources, tools, and groups working together behind the scenes. I am not going to go into detail about everything on this slide, but if you want more information, each logo has an embedded link, and we'll be sharing the presentation afterwards. John mentioned WorldCat in his talk. For any who might not know, WorldCat is an international union catalog of shared bibliographic records. Thousands of libraries around the world contribute records, and the database is around 550 million records currently. I can look in WorldCat and see that there are over 600 libraries that hold a copy of the new edition of Braiding Sweetgrass that came out in 2020, but there only needs to be one record for that book. For modern mass market materials, it's usually someone at the Library of Congress that creates the record before the book even gets published. That's what you're seeing if you notice a block of text called Cataloging in Publication or CIP data on a title page verso. Sometimes the CIP is incomplete. They didn't know exactly how many pages the book would end up being, for instance, but another cataloger comes along and takes that record and updates it and improves it. And the cooperation works because we all follow the same protocols. One of those protocols is MARC 21, which is the file format used in catalogs. MARC stands for Machine Readable Cataloging. It has been around since the late 60s, and yes, it is showing its age. There have been movements afoot for the last decade to move into a linked data format, and I'm sure that will happen eventually. I'm also afraid I'm starting to show my age when I say catalog, because Library Services Platform, or LSP, is the more up-to-date term. Folio is our new LSP here at Amherst. We are in a consortium with 4 other colleges, and we migrated to Folio last summer. I could talk for a very long time about that experience, but that would be a different presentation. So with that background, next slide, please. There are just a few things I'd like to point out that we are trying to do differently from standard cataloging for this collection. This is just some portions of a MARC record for a small pamphlet from 1926 that arrived in the initial portion of our collection. There was no WorldCat record. I created one. And the public displays of catalogs strip out the field numbers and indicators and delimiters that tell the LSP what each piece of data is, how to display it, how to index it. But I thought I would treat you to the behind the scenes view just for these next couple of slides. We have digitized and made publicly available 115 items from the KWE so far. This one is one of them. So it has a 530 field and an 856 field that indicates that. Notes fields, subjects fields are pretty standard. 700s are associated names. Eisenberg gets a former owner access point. Zikalasa, also known as Gertrude Bonin, gets an access point, both because she was probably assumedly one of the authors of this, and this is a signed copy. That form of her name is used because it's the authorized form in the LC name authority file, where there are also, that separate authority file record has see from references for Gertrude Bonin and Gertrude Simmons. Tip for all you authors out there: if you don't like the form of your name in the catalog, make friends with the cataloger. If they are a member of the Name Authority Cooperative Program, they might be able to help you out. The 655 is normally a genre field, and we've chosen to use that for now in our local catalog to provide access to tribal affiliation information on the author. So let's go to the next slide to look at that more closely. Here in this 1900 book, Francis LaFleche was Omaha, and the illustrator Angel DeCoro was Winnebago. And those access points have been added in that genre index. John mentioned people often being invisible in catalog records. That frequently happens with illustrators if they aren't specifically mentioned in the text. And that's something we're specifically attempting to bring forward in the records. This all works pretty well when there's just one author, or in this case, one author and one artist. But in the next slide, you'll see where the MARC format gets very unwieldy. This is a graphic novel anthology called This Place, 150 Years Retold. Has 10 different stories, 21 different authors. There was an about the contributors section, so we had their tribal affiliations. So we could put that information into the table of contents field and then create the access points, but it gets very unwieldy. This is where linked data or a semantic web ecosystem is going to work better for libraries in the future. Not to mention the form of the tribal names, which sometimes the Library of Congress and the tribe themselves do not agree on what the name should be. We are planning to try to make sure that we are following what the preferred tribal name is by the tribe. Last slide, please. And place of publication is what Brandon and I are working on mostly right now, trying to find a better solution for. The title page of Still They Remember Me says Amherst, and a human who's seeing that right next to the publisher, University of Massachusetts, can interpret that. But, and standard cataloging rules say that's fine. Rare books cataloging rules allow for adding a 752 field to provide hierarchical geographic information. But what we would like to start doing is we're working on figuring out a way to add a 751 possibly that will have a direct geotag with that geographical information. And I will hand it back over to Brandon to explain why we want that.
Yeah, so with that, our current project that we're working on right now with funding from the Mellon Foundation is mapping these places of publication. So over the last decade since the collection came to the college, the library has been working to enhance scholarly and community access to the collection. And our current project actually builds off of a project from 2016 that was funded by IMLS, Institute of Museum and Library Services, called the Digital Atlas of Native American Intellectual Traditions, which aimed to develop a digital interface which visualizes Native authored library and archival collections mapped across time and space, which we are in the process now of actively brainstorming using platforms such as ArcGIS and Folio, as well as community engagement with several Northeast Native authors to really see what this map would look like. And we have a couple of different iterations of this at the moment. With the project, we are also hoping to build regional networks with other colonial libraries. A recent development is the formation of the Northeast Regional and Digital Native American Archives Cooperative, also known as Nerdnack, which is a collaborative group of professional librarians, faculty, and scholars from 5 institutions: Amherst College, Brown University, Williams College, and the American Antiquarian Society, AAS. The group is composed of both Native and non-Native members, and endeavors to create collaborative and reciprocal relationships with tribal librarians, archivists, and knowledge keepers in the Northeast. So we see the work of Nerdnack as supporting efforts to work with tribal partners more efficiently and increase reciprocal learning opportunities between tribal and non-tribal institutions, ultimately aiming to improve ethical and informed stewardship of Indigenous materials. So along the way, we have been able to visit with Indigenous community members at various tribal archives, museums, and libraries in the Northeast, to identify community needs when it comes to accessing Indigenous collections, and also developing tribal archives and how colonial institutions can help share resources and training, and also link different collections in these catalogs. So ultimately, we really see knowledge sharing related to document preservation, metadata like Rebecca was sharing, and description, and collection management as a contribution to forming and sustaining reparative and reciprocal relationships with Native and Indigenous colleagues at tribal institutions. So yeah, again, that is known as Nerdnack. And we've been able to meet several times at various institutions throughout the past year. So in the meantime, with all of this going on here at the library, we continue to add to the collection, which is almost at about 3,400 books total, with recent acquisitions, including published works purchased from Etsy, from individual artists, book artists, as well as Red Planet Books and Comics, which is an Indigenous owned comic book store located in Albuquerque, New Mexico. So here's just a recent photo of Dr. Lee Francis visiting us here at Amherst College this past fall, where we were able to bring out all the materials from the collection from Red Planet, and students and staff and faculty were able to come and attend and listen to him speak about the store. So things like this are really important for us when we are bringing in artists to really build these relationships directly with Indigenous vendors as well. And of course, adding all the things from Red Planet, including the plushies and stickers and all the good stuff. So these are on equal fields, though, just as a final note, you know, as the older stuff like Sansamacum, we regard these as the same, having the same level of care and preservation. So yeah, just as a final statement, we just want to note that it's important that these policies and procedures related to the collection are part of this ongoing process of collaboration and outreach, to really allow for existing library policies and practices to more accurately reflect and respect Indigenous ways of knowing. So yeah, with that, we just want to say thank you for joining us this morning, and thank you to Dan and Amy for having us here today and the other panelists. It's been great to learn a little bit more. Please feel free to visit our site at Amherst College. We have this QR code here that'll lead you directly to more information about the collection. But with that, yeah, we just want to say thank you.
Thank you.